So if you are a fan of analytics, or honestly, even if you're not a fan of analytics, you've probably heard people talk about the difference between pressure and sacks. And the reason why sometimes people value a pressure more than a sack isn't because a pressure is more valuable than a sack, right? Obviously, the best thing you can do as an edge rusher outside of like a forced fumble is tackling the quarterback. But the reason why people tend to like pressure is they say that is a more consistent way year in and year out of evaluating an edge rusher. We've seen edge rushers have those seasons where they randomly end up with 14 sacks, but then go back to, not doing much. Like Vic Beasley comes to mind of the 17 sack season and then never coming close to that again. Sometimes you're able to just by happenstance get to the quarterback, and when you do, you just bring them to the ground at a higher rate than you have in any year prior. Basically, there's a big component of luck that goes into getting a sack, right? You can beat your tackle all you want, but if the quarterback gets rid of the ball quickly, or if there isn't pressure anywhere else and the quarterback can step somewhere else, there's only so much you can do, right? So this has actually become a bit of a accepted way of viewing things. A lot of people kind of agree, looking at pressure tends to be a better way at evaluating pass rushers than looking at sacks. But it got me to thinking, well then, should we maybe look at who is getting more pressure versus who is getting more sacks and kind of compare the two? And so that's what we're going to do in today's video. I'm going to look at just the most notable pass rushers, mostly edge rushers, but there are some interior guys who are thrown in here, and look at the players who consistently get more pressures than sacks, or at least did this last season, and the opposite, who got more sacks but maybe weren't getting a ton of pressures. So, I don't know, let's start off with the negatives, why don't we? Let's look at the guys who had really high sack counts, and the fan bases were able to cheer a lot, but maybe weren't actually that great at generating pressure last year, or maybe you still were really good at generating pressure, but got more sacks than you expect from the pressure you generated. So this is the chart, just to explain what you're looking at. You have the player's name, then their pressure totals, their sack totals, and finally, how many pressures to sacks did they have? So for example, if you had 30 pressures and 10 sacks, you'd end up with 3.0. So how many pressures to sacks did you have? You see Jonathan Cooper, Broncos edge rusher, 30 pressures, 10.5 sack season. Again, for these top guys, they're a bit on the quote-unquote lucky side or a bit on the high side here, but still nothing crazy. I think one thing maybe to step in right now and mention as well is just because you are a bit on the high side doesn't mean you are going to only be that way for this year. Trayvon Walker, next on this list, for his entire career, analytics people have been saying this guy isn't very good because, yes, he's had some high sack numbers, but the pressure number isn't that great. Well, I think enough time has passed in the NFL where it's fair to say he probably is just someone who, when he does get a pressure, he's more likely to end that pressure in a sack than your average player. So, 29 pressures, nothing to sneeze at. 10.5 sacks, pretty good. Maybe I'm hungry or something, I don't know. But then some other guys like Danielle Hunter, Odafe Owe, even TJ Watt last year was here, although, again, another guy who throughout his career has done a good job at turning his pressures into sacks. Leonard Williams, Nick Bonito. You then have some, Will Anderson as well. I think you would throw him in the a little bit high, but more understandable. Then you have some players who are pretty significantly in the, most of their pressures were seemingly turning into sacks. Andrew Van Ginkel, which this actually kind of makes some sense, him being with the Minnesota Vikings last year, they blitz a lot, so it doesn't seem that crazy to me that someone who's on a team that blitzes a lot could end up with just more situations where he kind of gets schemed into a sack, right? Or where when he does get a moment, it's easier for him to get a sack because there's more pressure around. As I brought up earlier, less spots for the quarterback to sneak into, so if he gets a pressure, he can turn it into a sack, something like that. Zach Sealer, the interior defensive lineman for the Dolphins, that's kind of crazy that at just 22 pressures as an interior guy, he ends up with 10 sacks. So that's very fascinating. He is a player who actually has had 10 sacks each of the past 2 seasons. Never had more than 3.5 prior to that, though, and is 29. So again, it has been 2 years, so maybe there's something there, or maybe it's just kind of a coincidence. It would be, those are kind of the interesting things that sometimes pop up. Usually when you see something like this, it's got kind of a, something to not make sure you throw a bag of money at is usually what happens, but not always. Kyle Van Noy of the Ravens, again, this guy had for every sack he had only just 2 pressures to it. Again, 25 pressures, though, is not a bad number. Like, getting 20 pressures is still a pretty solid season. It just usually doesn't result in double-digit sacks. So, again, Van Noy, a good player. Just because you get a little bit lucky doesn't mean you're a bad player, right? But I don't think you would expect Kyle Van Noy to, for the rest of his time in Baltimore, end up with something like this. Also, Dante Fowler Jr., who had a 10.5 sack season despite just 20 pressures. So he was actually under 2 pressures to a sack last season, which again kind of makes sense, right? Had this sort of breakout year all of a sudden, as he did have that 11.5 sack season back in 2019, has not had more than 6 since then. So again, sometimes when things like this pop up, but the pressure isn't also getting better, it might not be you had a great year, it might be you had a solid year and then got a little bit lucky. Now let's go to the other side of the coin, and we can just start off with the players who had the highest pressures compared to their sacks that we can see. Chris Jones at the top of the list. Again, being an interior guy, that kind of makes some sense, right? It is crazy he had 38 pressures as an interior guy. But again, you see his sack totals, only 5 sacks. Maybe he's not quite what he once was. Pressures would say otherwise. Jared Verse, another guy, young in his career, didn't get the quarterback on the ground a ton, only 4.5 sacks, but he was fantastic. And then Osa, I still haven't figured out how to say his last name. I apologize. But the Dallas Cowboys defensive lineman, another very actually the exact same stats as Jared Verse there. Very interesting. Yaya Diaby of Tampa Bay, another standout in that direction, a guy with only 4.5 sacks, but was constantly disrupting the quarterback. I think, maybe not having great pass rush on the opposite side of him meant that there was often places for the opposing quarterbacks to go to. Chase Young, you could argue some similar things, although they were a little better pass rushing opposite him. But, again, for people who say he's not very good, well, hey, he did have a lot of pressures last year. He's another guy, though, that his, kind of in the opposite way, he's always been a higher pressure to sack guy over his career. That it can happen that way as well, right? Zach Allen, another guy who, I think a lot of people are saying, hey, he had a pretty good year, 8.5 sacks as an interior guy, but 47 pressures as an interior guy. So similar to Chris Jones, except, he had more sacks and more pressures than Chris Jones, which is pretty fascinating. You have another Saints player here, Carl Granderson. So I don't know, maybe guys were just getting open quickly, and that's why they couldn't get the sacks. I don't know what was going on there. But both Granderson and Young did some good stuff getting to the quarterback, maybe not being able to bring him down, unfortunately. Max Crosby, you could say, only 7.5 sacks last year, a down year, but again, was constantly disrupting the quarterback. George Karlaftis, again, constantly disrupting the quarterback, and so was Greg Rousseau, and they still ended up with 8 sacks each. So these are guys who were probably 10 sack caliber guys who just maybe got a little bit unlucky, or maybe they're just worse at getting to the quarterback. That's the question, I suppose. But I do think this is worth talking about, and it's for guys like Jared Verse and Chris Jones, it's okay, they're probably still really good players, even if the sack totals didn't necessarily show that. For Kyle Van Noy, I think we all kind of knew 12.5 sacks was surprisingly high for him last year, and it's probably not repeatable. But then there's some players too where it's if you didn't make this list, it's because either you just didn't have enough sacks for me to talk about you, or it's because they were kind of around what you would expect them to be. They did the normal things, and sometimes those are the most notable players, even though I just didn't talk about them in the list because I didn't feel the need to. But that's what I think is interesting about all this stuff. So yeah, hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Always love hearing from you, and of course, as always, thanks for watching.